Shalom everyone, Neil here again for Hebrew in Israel, and as you can see I'm on location and I am in the gate of the famous city of Hazor. Hazor of the Galilee as well, is a major city that was actually very important for the control of this region, for its location, and specifically for its financial connections. Now I'm specifically standing here in the gate, and for me specifically, when I walk into gates like this, it always reminds me of classes I took in archaeology. And here's why. When you read the Tanakh, we have a few descriptions of King Solomon, and he builds different cities, including places like Gezer and Megiddo and so on. And one of the things that is the major feature for many people when you come into these places is actually the gate. Besides the gate being very, very important for the overall finances and work of the city, and this is usually where courts would sit, and this is sometimes where you can find officials, and the markets will be done in the entrance to the gate. What's also very important about the gate is the actual structure. The gates themselves are actually built in a protective way where you actually enter through an actual structure. This is not just a gate. There are actually chambers from both sides, and the chambers are very important for this discussion. And you would go in certain places you go in, but you don't go straight in, you would take an angle. Now, this is a protective measure, and it shows you that gates back in the ancient world wasn't just gates, it was actually part of the entire fortress that made the city into a city. But what's important about this specific gate is how it's built. It's built in a system where you actually have the pathway itself where I'm standing and chambers on both sides. Sometimes 2 chambers, sometimes 3 chambers. In our case, there are actually 3 chambers here. And what's important about this is that it was actually used for a very long time as a way to identify the cities that King Solomon built. However, the problem with this theory is that this style of building gates actually preceded King Solomon and belongs to a much earlier period. This is known as a Syrian gate, and the style of Syrian gates were actually imported to this region from the north and became a standardized way of building gates in cities. Therefore, it's very difficult to use this standard of how the gates were built to prove anything about who built and when. Now, for the point of the city of Hazor, city of Hazor is actually mentioned several times in the Tanakh, in the book of Joshua and the book of Kings, and even more so is actually also mentioned in other places outside of the Tanakh, such as the Ma'ari documents from the 18th century BC. Now, the city of Hazor was very important to conquer for 2 very important reasons. First of all, it's control in the area. When you actually stand in the city, even at the gate, you can actually get a very, very good view of everything around you, which is always very important for major cities. The same thing happens, for example, in the city of Gezer, where you actually stand on the top of the tell and you can see everything for miles. The other importance, and this is what comes out of the also from the Tanakh, which was the head of all the kingdoms in the area, is also the fact that it had a very, very strong connection to the commerce of the ancient world. As I said, it's mentioned in the letters of Ma'ari, and the whole point was that Hazor was very, very instrumental and very, very important in finances, in import and export to this region. And you also have to remember that the land of Israel was considered to be a bridge between Asia, and Asia back then was actually more the area of Syria, Anatolia, and the north part of Asia, but actually a major bridge between Africa and Egypt, the East, and also parts of Europe before they actually developed sea travel through the Mediterranean. So one of the key principles of economics in the ancient world is the production of surplus. Surplus basically means that when you produce something on a local level, you produce enough quantity that goes beyond what you actually need for your everyday life consumption. Now, putting aside the whole discussion of how much a person would consume in the ancient world compared to how much a person would consume today, we still have to realize that whatever they did back then, the quantities that they would consume in everyday life, or even throughout a cycle of a year, they reached a point where they discovered that you can actually take produce and preserve it in different ways. And probably one of the biggest catalysts, the production of surplus in the ancient world, was actually the production of olive oil. And actually what we have behind me here is an ancient oil press. Now when I say ancient oil press, I mean something that's really, really old, not just the oil presses that we usually see from Roman times, but even earlier than that. And the whole principle was that when you brought the olives in, you had to crush them a little bit to break the skin and so on. But the actual production of oil came from pressing the oil in baskets with a rock on top, and then a person pressing on the actual baskets with the rock, holding a lever that will cause the oil to come down into a stone, and from that stone you can actually see it where there's an opening and the oil will pour out. And what happened was that they realized you can keep this material, unlike most perishables, you can actually preserve oil for a very, very long time, and oil itself can be a preservative. Therefore, it produced the possibility of creating surplus, which increased the possibility of enlarging the economic value of things, which meant that people could actually start buying and selling things in a much wider way. And this enabled certain areas, especially areas that have a surplus of certain items, specifically the land of Israel, would be olive oils and even grains sometimes, to be able to make agreements with other areas, and even not even other cities, but entire different countries, and bring whatever you produce in your area to another area through the caravans. Now, caravans were very, very important, had to be guarded, and later on we'll go up and we'll actually see a guard tower where we can see into the roads of this area. However, what's mostly important is the fact that by producing a surplus, cities could grow. The possibility of urbanization of areas and making cities grow for certain people or characters in the past to become leaders of different areas was only possible because of economics. And economics is probably a key factor to this very day of how any area is governed. Okay, we've reached another interesting part of the city, and this is actually the water system that was built to provide water for the city. Now, as everyone knows, in the ancient world there were no taps, and you actually had to work hard to get almost everything in your life, including your water. Now, it was a very common practice for people to build cities near other sources of water, such as a fountain or a stream or a river, anything like that. And very commonly in the land of Israel, most places were built next to fountains of different sorts, known in Hebrew as an ayin. And what happened was that you would actually have to physically go out, take your jar, and go fill up your water. Sometimes certain cities would actually have also a well nearby, and those wells would either go into the aquifer or would be connected to some kind of fountain. However, when you reach a situation of war, which unfortunately the history of man is the history of war, as one of the most famous historians would say, they had to find a way around this problem. Different places did different things, such as, for example, in Jerusalem, they fortified the Shiloach, and they built a wall around it, and then built a way into that water. And even before them, in the Canaanite period, they built some kind of vats that enabled them to reach the aquifer and so on. However, not every place has that possibility. So what they did here is they actually dug inside the city and into the aquiferic level, and when the city was at siege, they could dig down, they could go down underground and collect water from there. Now, the understanding is that this water system was built, or actually excavated, in the 9th century, around the times of King Ahab. So this is an Israelite water system, and it goes down around 40 meters. And by going down all the way down there, usually you had a very good supply of water. However, it's important to remember that the aquifer is also connected to how much rain actually falls. So in a time where there's almost no rain, or when you start going deeper into the summer, the quantity of water will actually drop, and sometimes sources like this can dry out. And that will basically be a disaster for the city. However, cities could last a very long time if there was enough rain, and if they were smart enough about how they managed their water supply and how much they took in. You have to remember that people back then didn't really shower as much as we would today, so most of the water would actually be for drinking or cooking, and less for basically having swimming pools and things like that. So they were pretty good in preserving their water. However, a person does need to drink several liters of water per day, somewhere in the area, if I use the American standard, somewhere in the area of a gallon, which does require quite a bit of water. So at the time of a siege, one will have to reduce the consumption of water, which also would reduce the amount of movement one will do in a day, or the amount of activity a person would have in a day. However, it's also important to remember that though the Galilee, where Hazor is is a relatively green area. It's also important to remember that this area can get very hot during the summer, and it can become very dangerous for a person if they don't consume enough water. So they used to build places like this to try at least resolve part of the problems when a siege happens. So we are standing now inside the palace of the city. Usually palaces are somewhere towards the top of the tel, and as you can see, this is mostly reconstructed. Only very small parts on the bottom are actually from the original structure. And what's really important about this place is that this will actually be one of the most important administrative centers in the city itself. Now, lately there's been a lot of discussions about hoping to find a archive of some sort in the city itself, which will give us some information more about what was going on in the city. Now, as an historian, written material, also known as epigraphia, is one of the most important things that we can find, because unlike finding something like a structure or a statue or even a piece of pottery or something, these are all considered to be silent items. And we actually have to reconstruct the story of these items based on where they were found, what period they belong to, maybe sometimes traces of things that might be attached to it. However, written material is really what we can call real pure history, because what it does is it enables us to actually know more about the names of the people, who was king when, who did what were the economics of the city, what were the everyday life activities, sometimes things that have to do with trials and items like that, correspondence with other areas. Now, I mentioned earlier that the city of Hazor is mentioned in a letter from Ma'ari, and we actually have a problem with the city of Hazor. There are only 2 pieces of written documents are actually discovered here, 2 letters written in cuneiform, very, very small letters with a few names here and there, but that's all that's actually been discovered. So the big hope is that one day an actual archive will be found, because if Hazor was so central, it must have been that there were more letters coming in and out of such a place. We have letters coming from even smaller places, such as Tel Arad, Tel Megiddo, Lachish, the famous letters of Lachish, the famous letters of Arad, the famous letters of Shomron. However, for Hazor, nothing has been found, and Hazor was a big player in the ancient world. So maybe, hopefully, one day we'll discover something. Only time will tell. So we reached our last point in this journey in the city of Hazor. We've actually reached what's known as the Israelite fortress. Again, this fortress is considered to be something from around times of King Achav. And as you can notice, I mentioned King Achav over and over again. And it's actually very important, because what we discover is the family of Achav, which actually is mentioned as the house of Omri, is mentioned over and over again in different documents, including, for example, the Misha Stela, from the king of Moab. And what we discover there is that the kingdom of the north, the northern kingdom of Israel, was known as the house of Omri, after probably one of the most important families that ruled over the northern kingdom. It seems to be that King Achav, and probably even some projects that began with his father Omri, were very, very instrumental in the development of the northern kingdom. So around his time, in the 9th century, they built a lot. And what we're looking at here is probably one of these projects. And this project actually, what's interesting, faces a major road in this area. If we're looking that direction, we have valleys and everything, but there's also a major road behind us here. And what this required was protection. They also discovered inside this site a religious or cultic site with several cultic items such as incense burners and so on. And also what was discovered was a tower. And this tower looked over the road. And actually, when we were driving up here, I could see it from a distance, and that's how I actually recognized it was the Tel Hazor. Now, what's interesting is that watchful eyes kept this place for a very, very long time. However, when an overwhelming, powerful army shows up, it won't help you. And what happened here, and this is the sad ending of the Israelite presence in Hazor, is the destruction of Hazor in 732 by Tiglath-Pileser III, the king of Assyria. He came here, he punished the area, he destroyed many, and basically he slowly destroyed the northern kingdom until in 720 to 721, there's a bit of a debate exactly what year it was, The city of Shomron was also captured, and that actually symbolized the fall of the northern kingdom. However, now we're living modern Israel, and we're back in these lands, we're back living here, and we're basically turning around to people like Tiglath-Pileser, who wanted to expand their empires and take over lands that do not belong to them, saying we're back, we're here, and we're here to stay.